Today, we're tackling something really foundational, especially if you're interested in global politics, economics, or, specifically anti-colonial and decolonial thought.
It's a big one.
We're basically deconstructing the entire idea of development, how it's been applied, particularly in Africa for, 70-plus years now?
Yeah, it's a radical exercise, but I think a really necessary one. We're digging into sources that offer this deep critique, tracing development right back.
Back to the European Enlightenment.
Exactly, from its philosophical roots all the way through to modern global capitalism. We're not just talking about policy failures here. We're questioning the entire intellectual scaffolding that makes certain policies seem, well, inevitable.
And the core argument from these sources, as I understand it, is that the current neoliberal development model, the one you hear about from the big institutions, often presented as the only game in town.
Right.
It's actually not new at all. It's essentially the European Enlightenment project, this idea of a universal, necessary modernity just kind of scaled up globally.
Scaled up and repackaged, yeah. So today's deep dive is about constructing a genealogy, a history of that specific idea, development as modernity. And we need to analyze why it keeps leading to what scholars call Africa's development impasse.
Okay, but before we get lost in the philosophy and the history,
Yeah.
we need to ground this. The critique starts from a stark reality, right?
Absolutely. You have to start with the undeniable fact. Africa, broadly speaking, remains profoundly underdeveloped, and this is despite decades, over 50 years, of intense, internationally funded, managed development efforts.
The numbers from the late 90s, which kind of set the stage for the current era, they're just staggering. Low GNP, chronically low income per person.
They are. But it's the human cost, the human indicators that really hit home. Think about it. Adult illiteracy back then, hovering around 43%, access to clean drinking water. Only 47% of people had that.
Less than half.
Less than half. And life expectancy, even before you fully factor in the major pandemics, was stuck at just 57 years. It's a picture of just ongoing, severe crisis.
And this persists despite huge amounts of aid, despite these global economic models being pushed for decades.
Precisely. It forces you to ask, how is this possible? How can all that effort, all that money, leave things in such a state? The standard fixes, the usual policies, they just haven't delivered sustained autonomous development. So the problem must lie deeper. It's not just about poor execution,
Right. It's the foundations themselves. Okay, let's start digging into that foundation. If the problem is philosophical, historical, where do we pinpoint the moment the current system got locked in? Why 1950? Why is that year singled out as this crucial watershed?
Yeah, 1950 is key. It's really the moment when this whole development thinking gets formalized within a Western institutional structure. Even as formal colonialism is starting to crumble, three big things are happening simultaneously shaping this.
Okay, what's the first?
First, development economics emerges as a distinct field of study specifically focused on, quote-unquote, poor economies.
Right, so it immediately sets up this category.
Yeah.
The poor world, separate, different, and inherently lacking something.
Exactly. And this new field, right from the start, often conflated simple economic growth, just making more stuff, with genuine development, which is much deeper. Structural change, social change, political transformation. That got sidelined.
Okay, so that's one. What's the second factor around 1950?
Second, this period marks the real decisive onset of neo-colonialism.
Neo-colonialism, we hear that term a lot. How do the sources define it in this specific context? What did it look like then?
Well, Western powers, the imperial forces, they weren't stupid. They saw the writing on the wall with independence movements. Formal colonial rule, boots on the ground, wasn't sustainable politically.
So they needed a plan B.
A plan B, exactly. They devised new ways, indirect ways, to maintain control. Neo-colonialism was the name for these tactics, ensuring that Africa's markets, its labor, and crucially, its natural resources remained available for Western use and extraction.
So the flags changed, but the economic plumbing stayed the same.
Pretty much. It marked a shift, you could say, from a purely colonial mode of production to a more subtle, financially driven neo-colonial one. Dependence continued, just in a different guise.
Okay. And the third factor from this 1950 moment, this one seems to complicate things, especially for people looking for alternatives back then.
Yeah, the third factor is the entry of Marxism onto the African political and intellectual stage.
As an alternative model.
Well, it arrived in various forms as an ideology for liberation struggles, as a tool for analysis, and yes, as what looked like an alternative path to development. It offered a powerful anti-capitalist critique, no doubt about it. It energized a lot of independence movements.
But, and this is the crucial point from the critique we're exploring, these sources see a deep connection an intellectual unity between the Western bourgeois modernization theories and Marxism.
Despite them being political enemies.
That's the core insight, and it's profound. Despite all their surface-level antagonism, both camps fundamentally define development as modernity. Both bought into the idea that Africa had to modernize by following a predetermined historical script.
So they were both children of the same parent, intellectually speaking, the European Enlightenment.
Exactly. Both offspring of that larger Enlightenment project. Their shared goal, whether capitalist or communist, was still the modernizing, the enlightening of Africa according to a European blueprint.
How did that play out?
Well, Marxism, having kind of missed out on the first scramble for Africa, the colonial land grab, it pushed its own version of modernity, state control, heavy industry, central planning, starting around the 50s. Meanwhile, the bourgeois economic theories, they became the intellectual apology for neo-colonialism.
Defining Africa as lacking, needing Western help. Precisely. Defining African societies by their deficits and prescribing Western solutions. So they were fighting fiercely over the how of modernization, but both fundamentally accepted this idea of development as an inevitable universal march towards Western-style modernity.
And this shared acceptance, this is the universal trap you mentioned. How does that trap actually work?
It goes back to this idea of history having only one path, a unilinear teleological view of change. Marxists had their stages: primitive, slave Asiatic, feudal, capitalist, history marching towards a goal.
Okay.
Bourgeois theory, people like Rostow, they just put different labels on the same idea. Stages of growth, modernization. It's the same underlying assumption.
The assumption being that African societies, despite their own unique histories, cultures, contexts, they just have to become clones of the modern West.
That is the trap, in a nutshell. It denies Africa the right to think for itself, to draw on its own experiences, its own knowledge, to forge its own path. If the destination is already decided, if Africa's future is just Europe's past, then everything local, everything indigenous is automatically labeled pre-modern, deficient.
Making outside intervention seem not just helpful, but necessary.
Necessary and even benevolent. And that impossibility of developing authentically on its own terms, that's the deep root of the impasse we still see today.
Okay, to really get the weight of this universal trap, we need to go back further. We need to properly understand this Enlightenment. I mean, most people think of it as, the age of reason, science, progress in Europe. How does a European intellectual movement from centuries ago become Africa's development problem now?
Right, it seems like a leap, but the connection is direct. The Enlightenment, at its heart, was the age of reason. It was a conscious, you could say, ideological project. Its goal was the victory of human reason over a religious faith and theological dogma.
Breaking away from the medieval world.
Totally. Before the Enlightenment, European life was structured around things like the Great Chain of Being. Authority came from God, from sacred texts. Kings ruled by a divine right. The church held the monopoly on truth and knowledge.
And the Enlightenment thinkers wanted to smash that system.
A radical rupture, yes. They didn't just see it as philosophy, they saw it as a pedagogical movement, a project to build a completely new way of understanding the world, rational, scientific, ordered. They set out to create this massive encyclopedia of knowledge where everything, physics, politics, society could be explained by human reason and observation, not by God's will.
And this leads directly to the idea of progress.
Inevitably. The belief took hold that humanity, using science and reason, could engineer a better future, constant improvement, more prosperity, more justice. It's a powerful, optimistic vision.
And central to making this vision work was the invention of a new kind of person, the modern subject.
Yes, humanitas. This new subject emerges as knowledge becomes scientific. It's defined in a few key ways. First, it's sovereign. Political legitimacy flows from the individual, from the people, not from God.
Okay.
Second, it's autonomous. The individual isn't just a cog in a divine machine or bound by tradition. They think and act for themselves. And third, crucially, it's rational, guided by objective reason, by facts, by science. This modern subject becomes the bedrock. All legitimate politics, economics, knowledge, it's all supposed to spring from this rational individual.
But, and this seems absolutely critical to the critique, this new rational European subject didn't exist in a vacuum. It needed an opposite, an other.
That's the unavoidable flip side, the dark underbelly, if you like. Enlightenment thinking works by creating these pairs, these binaries, but they're not equal pairs, they're asymmetric. modern versus pre-modern, Western versus Oriental, rational versus irrational.
And one side is always superior.
Always. The lead concept, the West, the modern subject, gets defined as the endpoint, the universal standard, the destination of history.
While the other, Africa, the East, gets defined purely by what it lacks compared to that standard.
Exactly. The other becomes the anthropos, just raw humanity, not fully realized, or the Oriental, defined by absence. Lacking reason, lacking autonomy, lacking proper history. They're stripped of their own agency, their own ways of thinking. They become simply objects.
Objects to be studied.
Studied, categorized, controlled. This is the role of things like colonial anthropology, those old travel writings. Their function wasn't just observation, it was to define the other in a way that confirmed the superiority and universality of the European modern subject.
And this wasn't just an abstract philosophical game. It tied directly into the economics of the time.
Oh, absolutely. You have to remember what modernity actually meant in 18th century Europe. It meant a specific kind of society taking shape, a capitalist industrial society.
Nation-states, factories, cities, bureaucracy.
All of that. So development immediately got fused with that specific model, European modernity, the capitalist way of organizing things. By framing European history as the one true path for everyone, the Enlightenment provided the perfect philosophical cover, the justification, for Europe's economic expansion across the globe.
Okay, so let's trace how this master idea development as modernity actually got applied to Africa. We can see roughly 3 phases, each with a different kind of domination. Let's start with early modernity.
Right. This is the mercantile capitalism phase, roughly 15th to 18th centuries. What was the main focus then regarding Africa?
The primary task during this era was basically intellectual groundwork. They needed to construct a way of thinking, a discourse that made Africa and its people seem like, well, legitimate targets for plunder.
So justifying the unjustifiable.
Pretty much. Mercantile capitalism was driven by profit trade, grabbing resources, forced labor, especially the slave trade. But emerging European ideas about humanism and morality created a problem. How could you justify the sheer brutality, the scale of the violence and exploitation? You needed a philosophical loophole.
Exactly. Enlightenment thought provided that loophole by creating 2 different sets of rules. One for Europe reason, morality, universal rights for the modern subject, and a completely different one for Africa. Barbarism, backwardness, superstition, deficiency.
This Orientalist split-screen view.
Yes. It effectively cleansed the European conscience. It made the horrors permissible, the mass violence of the slave trade, stealing vast mineral wealth, even capturing African people like Sarah Bartman and displaying them in European museums like scientific specimens or, frankly, objects of morbid curiosity.
Defining them as less than human paved the way for treating them as less than human.
That's the mechanism. It denies agency. And economically, this period was crucial. It set the pattern. The philosophy generated an economic theory that said Europe should pursue auto-centered development. Their own internal needs, their own investments should drive their economies.
But for Africa,
the opposite. Their economies, their internal structures, were forced to reorganize entirely around external European demands. For raw materials, for slaves, this is the origin story of Africa's externally dependent economies, the ones still struggling today.
Okay, let's move to the next phase. Capitalist modernity. Roughly 18th century up to the mid-20th. This is the age of full-blown colonialism.
Right. Colonialism is the moment when that Orientalist discourse, that way of thinking about Africa, gets fully baked into the actual practice of capital accumulation. It becomes a total project.
Economic, political, social, intellectual, the whole package.
The whole package, the infamous civilizing mission. Now, lots of critical economists focus rightly on the extraction of surplus value, the pure economic exploitation. That was massive. But colonialism was also something deeper. It functioned as this profound intersubjective space.
Intersubjective space. That's a fascinating phrase. What does that mean in practical terms? Why was it as important as just grabbing resources?
It's about identity. It refers to the psychological and cultural field where the identities of both the colonizer and the colonized were formed in relation to each other. Think of it like this. The colonial project was, in a way, necessary to prove the Enlightenment's claims about European superiority.
It needed validation.
It needed validation. Psychoanalytic and sociological work suggests it guaranteed the European sense of self, their feeling of having a superior consciousness, a superior personality. This was especially important for Europeans who were maybe lower down the ladder back home.
You mean like the minor administrators, the soldiers, the adventurers, people who weren't elites in Europe.
Exactly. Maybe they were poor, maybe they were, former criminals shipped out, school dropouts. In Europe, they might have been nobodies. But in the colonies, through this system, they instantly became superior, unequivocally superior to every single African.
Wow.
The system allowed even the most marginal European to view Africans as objects, there to serve their needs or confirm their status. It reinforced the idea that they, the Europeans, were part of the lead concept of history, that deep psychological need for status, for identity validation. You could argue it was just as powerful a driver for colonialism as the pure economics.
Okay. And then jumping forward to the 1950s, when development economics finally emerges as its own discipline,
Yeah.
it just inherits this whole legacy.
It becomes the modern update, the new intellectual apology. Bourgeois economic theory basically took the existing colonial mindset and gave it scientific-sounding language. It defined underdevelopment as the gap, the deficit between the features of the developed West, nation-states, industry, etc., and the underdeveloped state of Africa.
And filling that gap became the mission.
That gap was the development agenda. Simple as that. The early pioneers, Rostow, with his stages of growth, Arthur Lewis, they were essentially just repeating the Enlightenment mantra. Africa needs Western help to modernize. There's only one path, the Western path, and everyone has to follow it. It was non-negotiable.
So this colonial DNA is deeply embedded in the concept of development. How does that play out today? In this era of what the sources call hypermodernity, global capitalism, neoliberalism, what do the policies look like now?
Right, hypermodernity. The idea isn't that the fundamental structure has changed, but that its capacity has intensified. Technology, finance, they allow for a much more efficient extraction of surplus value.
Like outsourcing.
Exactly. Transferring the messy parts of capitalism, manufacturing pollution, low-wage jobs to the periphery, and also, crucially, extending the logic of the market, of exchange value into totally new areas. Think intellectual property, data, genetics.
Commodifying everything.
Everything. From this critical perspective, globalization isn't some brand new liberating force. It's just the continuation of the old civilizing mission, but now wearing the clothes of neoliberalism as its global discourse.
Okay, let's break down the pillars of this current neoliberal model as applying to development. Pillar 1 seems to be this massive focus on foreign direct investment, FDI, and the idea of a financing gap.
Yeah, this is central. The model leans heavily on some, frankly, quite outdated classical growth theories, especially the Herr-Domar model. The basic logic goes like this. Africa has a low domestic savings rate. The World Bank often cited it around 13% of GDP, among the world's lowest.
Okay.
This low savings supposedly creates a big shortfall in the capital needed for investment. A financing gap, often pegged at maybe 12% of GDP.
And the prescription.
Simple. This gap must be filled by external capital, Western aid, loans, and especially foreign direct investment. That's the only way, the model says, to hit the growth targets needed to, say, halve poverty by 2015, or whatever the target du jour is.
It sounds straightforward, almost mechanical. Invest X, get Y growth. What's the problem with that? Why is it flawed for African economies?
Well, the core assumption of models like Herr-Domar is something called the constant capital output ratio, or CCR. It basically assumes a stable, predictable relationship. Add 1 unit of capital, you get a fixed amount of extra output every time.
Like a machine.
Exactly like a machine. It completely ignores reality on the ground. Things like weak institutions, lack of skilled labor, terrible infrastructure, political instability, all the structural rigidities that actually exist. Domar himself, way back in 1957, admitted his own model was just a short-term theoretical exercise, not realistic for predicting actual growth. It's just too simplistic, too mechanical for complex post-colonial economies.
And the real-world data backs up this flaw. Aid doesn't just magically turn into productive investment.
The data is pretty clear on this. It's quite damning, actually. You look at the period from 1970 to 1997, African countries received huge amounts of aid, cumulatively something like 205% of their GDP over that time. Massive sums. Yet, their domestic investment rates basically flatlined, stuck around 18%. The aid just wasn't translating into the kind of investment the model predicted or required. And even when investment happens, the link to growth is shaky. Studies looking at actual high-growth periods found that something like 94% of them didn't meet the investment conditions the model said were necessary. The link just isn't there in that simple, mechanical way.
So the money comes in, but it doesn't automatically lead to the promised growth and the FDI that does arrive. Where does it actually go? Does it help build the broader economy?
Generally, no. That's the disappointing part. FDI flows overwhelmingly into very specific sectors, mostly mineral enclaves, oil, gas, diamonds, copper, gold. These are often like islands within the economy.
Self-contained.
Very self-contained. They have almost no linkages backward or forward with the rest of the domestic economy. They import equipment, export the raw commodity, repatriate profits. They don't stimulate local industry much. The other big chunk of FDI goes into buying up state-owned companies during privatization drives.
Often at bargain prices, the fire sale argument.
Often at fire sale terms, yes. So, this isn't creating new productive capacity. It's just transferring ownership of existing assets, often from public to foreign private hands. It reinforces dependency, facilitates resource plunder, and leads to capital flight as profits leave the country.
And then there's the issue of speculative capital, right? Hot money.
Oh, absolutely. That's another major problem. This is short-term money attracted by maybe high interest rates set under austerity programs. It pours in looking for quick returns.
But it's not interested in building factories.
Not at all. It's purely speculative. And because it's short-term, it's incredibly volatile. If global conditions shift or local sentiment changes, that money floods out just as quickly as it came in. This destabilizes currencies, drains reserve, and can trigger financial crises. It actively undermines long-term, stable, productive investment.
Okay, pillar 2. The infamous macroeconomic reforms and austerity, the heart of structural adjustment programs imposed by the IMF and World Bank.
Yes, the standard package. Fiscal austerity cut government spending, privatizations sell off state assets, trade liberalization open up markets, currency devaluation make exports cheaper, imports more expensive. The irony here, the incoherence, is pretty staggering.
How so?
Because these policies fly directly in the face of the original Keynesian thinking that led to the creation of the IMF and World Bank in the first place. Back in the 40s, Keynes argued for expansionary policy during slumps. Governments should spend more to stimulate demand when the economy is weak.
But the IFIs demand the exact opposite from developing countries. Cut spending, tighten belts, even in a recession.
Precisely. It's pure market fundamentalism. They fixate on budget deficits and inflation as the absolute evils. The argument is that government borrowing crowds out private investment.
But does it?
Well, most serious economists argue the opposite, especially in developing economies. Productive public spending on health, education, and crucially, infrastructure like roads, power grids, ports, internet that actually crowds in private investment. It makes the whole economy work better, making it more attractive for businesses to invest.
So what happens when you force austerity instead? What are the real impacts?
The real impacts are devastating. Mandatory deficit cutting leads directly to slashing budgets for schools, hospitals, clean water, the essential social fabric. And critically, it means cutting investment in basic infrastructure.
Which then fall apart.
Exactly. Roads crumble, power supplies become unreliable, ports get congested, and then guess what? These same international institutions point to this dilapidated infrastructure in their next report as proof of African underdevelopment and inefficiency, justifying yet more external intervention and control. The policies literally create the conditions they claim to be solving.
It's a vicious cycle. And the obsession with low inflation targets, how does that fit in?
That's another key part of the austerity package, this relentless focus on getting inflation down to single digits, even if it's already relatively low. To do this, they force African central banks to keep interest rates really high.
Which attracts that hot money we talked about.
It does attract volatile foreign capital, yes. But think about what it does domestically. It makes it incredibly expensive for local businesses, local entrepreneurs to borrow money.
Who can afford to build a factory or start a new business if they have to borrow at, say, 18 or 20% interest?
Nobody competitive globally. It kills domestic industrial investment. It also makes government debt more expensive to service. So instead of stimulating growth in stagnant economies, this policy actively suppresses the kind of structural investment needed for real development. It pushes economies deeper into recession and deindustrialization.
Okay, finally, pillar 3, trade liberalization. Based on this idea of static comparative advantage, this feels like the most direct link back to the colonial economic structure.
It really is the most blatant continuation, yes. The standard theory Ricardian, Heckscher Olin, says countries should specialize in producing whatever they have a natural comparative advantage in. For Africa, that's almost always identified as primary commodities: cocoa, coffee, cotton, minerals, oil.
But the critique argues this advantage isn't natural at all.
Not even remotely. It was imputed, it was engineered, imposed through centuries of mercantile capitalism and direct colonial rule.
How did colonialism create that specialization?
Systematically, colonial policies actively suppressed any potential local manufacturing that might compete with industries back in the mother country. They destroyed existing craft industries through unequal competition. They often outright prohibited the building of factories.
Right.
Infrastructure, like railways and ports, wasn't built to connect African markets internally. It was built to efficiently extract resources from the interior and ship them out to Europe. So Africa's specialization in primary goods today isn't some natural economic destiny. It's the direct calculated result of historical plunder and structural deformation.
So the theory of comparative advantage, when applied now, just locks in that historical disadvantage. It's static.
That's the fatal flaw. It's a static theory. It aims to preserve the existing global division of labor, the one created by colonialism. And when you force infant African industries, which were deliberately held back, to suddenly compete head-on with mature, powerful Western economies.
Which, by the way, protected their own industries when they were developing.
Exactly. The hypocrisy is immense. When you force that premature opening, the result is predictable. Deindustrialization. Local firms can't compete, they go under. Look at the trends. Between the 50s and the 90s, Africa's share of world trade actually fell dramatically under these policies. It leads to these extroverted economies, totally dependent on fluctuating global commodity prices, facing constantly worsening terms of trade.
And adding insult to injury, the West preaches free trade but practices protectionism.
Oh, absolutely. It's double jeopardy. While demanding Africa/tariffs and open up, Western countries maintain high tariffs and subsidies, especially on agricultural products that are vital exports for many African nations. Average tariffs on African agricultural goods entering Western markets can be around 20%.
Crippling.
It's crippling. So you're dependent on commodity exports, but face barriers selling them. And often you're also a net importer of food, which becomes more expensive due to devaluation. The whole neoliberal project, viewed this way, looks less like a path to development and more like a sophisticated Western strategy to maintain a global structure that benefits the core at the expense of the periphery, all under the guise of inevitable modernization.
Okay, we've traced this arc from Enlightenment philosophy, creating the modern subject and its other, through colonial justification, right up to today's neoliberal policies. It paints a picture of a system inherently designed, or at least functioning, to maintain dependency, the impasse of modernity. So the big question, especially for listeners interested in decolonial futures, is how do we break free? How do we escape what the sources call the blackmail of the Enlightenment, this idea that you have to be either for Western modernity or against it with no other options?
Right. Escaping that binary is key. The sources discuss two main lines of thought on how to transcend this impasse. The first involves engaging with and critiquing a major defender of modernity, the philosopher Jürgen Habermas.
Habermas argues modernity isn't finished yet. It's an incomplete project.
Exactly. Habermas's view is that modernity contains the tools for its own self-correction. Its internal contradictions and tensions actually drive it forward. So when people criticize its failings, say, demanding debt relief or fairer trade or structural adjustment with a human face,
They're actually just helping modernity improve itself, fine-tuning the system.
that's Habermas's point. He sees these critiques as internal self-criticisms. By participating in these debates, demanding reforms within the existing framework, critics unintentionally end up strengthening modernity's toolkit, reinforcing its claim to be the only universal game in town.
So that's a warning. Simply trying to make neoliberalism nicer doesn't break the cage. It just redecorates it.
Precisely. It keeps you operating inside the universal trap. That leads to the second, more radical path, which draws inspiration from Kant, but particularly through the lens of Michel Foucault. It's about adopting a different attitude.
Okay, how does Kant fit in here? Wasn't he part of the Enlightenment?
He was central, but his definition of enlightenment is key. He famously used the Latin phrase sapere ad, dare to know, or maybe better, dare to use your own understanding. For Kant, enlightenment was humanity finally growing up, emerging from a state of self-incurred immaturity.
And what was that immaturity?
The inability or unwillingness to think for oneself without relying on external guidance from the church, from the king, from tradition.
And the colonial project basically defined Africa as being stuck in that immature state, needing Western guidance.
That's exactly how the discourse worked. The West cast itself as the permanent adult, the guardian, responsible for the immature African child. And the language of development continues this. The guardian is always warning the child about the dangers of trying to walk alone. Don't try that alternative path, it leads to ruin. Or, there is simply no alternative to our model. The guardian sets the limits on what's even thinkable.
So the way out is to reject the guardian, to dare to use one's own understanding as concept.
It's to reclaim that autonomy of thought. This is where Foucault's interpretation comes in. Foucault suggested we should see modernity not as a fixed historical period or destination we have to reach, but as an attitude, a specific way of relating to the present.
What kind of attitude?
An attitude of permanent critique. A relentless, autonomous questioning of our present reality, of the assumptions we live under, of the power structures that shape our lives. Adopting that attitude allows us to take apart, to deconstruct this whole equation of development equals Western modernity.
So it's about reclaiming the right to think differently, to define problems and solutions from an African perspective.
Exactly. The goal is to build an African-centered way of knowing, an epistemic order, free from the dogma, whether it's Marxist dogma or neoliberal dogma that has stifled autonomous thought for so long.
Is this just a philosophical shift, or do the sources see signs of this happening in the real world?
They definitely see signs. The argument is that the unquestioned dominance, the hegemony of Western modernity is already fraying. You see it in the massive popular challenges to neoliberalism across the continent.
Like protests?
Like the ongoing struggles in the Niger Delta over resource control and environmental destruction. Like the waves of protests in South Africa demanding better services, challenging inequality, expressing alienation from the post-apartheid economic model. These aren't just pleas for minor reforms. They are often deep structural challenges to the way things are. They signify a rejection of the current order.
So the final step is to connect that critical attitude, that popular resistance, to a coherent alternative vision.
That's the challenge and the opportunity. The current global system feels more uncertain, more fluid than it has in decades. That creates openings. The task is to seize this moment, to create the space for defining national historical projects that are aligned with Africa's own needs and priorities, not imported blueprints. It means finally breaking free from the compulsion to just copy Western history and instead forging a development path rooted in African realities. Hashtag #OutterTrousAround.
Wow, this has been, well, a genuinely deep dive. We've gone from 15th century philosophy to 21st century finance, and the thread connecting it all is pretty stark. I think the huge takeaway for me is this inherent contradiction within Western modernity itself.
How so?
It arrived on the shores of Africa and elsewhere, talking about freedom, reason, progress, development. But its actual historical function, time and again, seems to have been the exact opposite. Masking exploitation, justifying domination, denying the very autonomy it claimed to champion. That civilizing mission narrative was incredibly effective cover.
It was, and looking ahead, this whole critique leaves us with a really provocative thought, something the political theorist Partha Chatterjee articulated. He said, if for the West, achieving modernity meant escaping from its past, escaping feudalism, escaping theocracy.
And then for Africa.
For Africa, constructing its own modernity on its own terms will mean escaping from the present.
It's escaping the present.
Escaping the present system defined by that Enlightenment-based economic theory, by global capitalism's current structures and the dependency they create. That's the real challenge.
Escaping the present. That implies a radical break and brings up a huge question about leadership, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The sources seem quite critical of the post-independence African elites, suggesting they often allied themselves with Western modernity, adopting its structures and becoming, in a sense, compromised.
Yes, that critique is definitely there. The argument is that their progressive potential often faded after independence as they became managers of the existing neo-colonial system.
So if the current elites and the imported models are part of the problem, who leads this escape? Who builds this alternative autonomous future? Does the critique offer an answer, or is that the question left for Africans themselves to answer by reclaiming that autonomy of thought?
I think the latter. The very act of reclaiming the autonomy to ask and answer that question, free from external blueprints, is the first essential step towards liberation. It begins, as Foucault suggested, with that critical interrogation of your own reality.
A powerful place to leave it. Thank you for joining us on The Deep Dive.